Looking at this stunning bamboo sanctuary in the wild, few would believe it began by walking away from $1 million inheritance. Jack lost faith in his family after a bitter battle over money. He left with nothing but his loyal dog, Cooper, and a worn notebook containing his late father's dream sketches. Using hands once hardened by war, he meticulously wove every bamboo strand and ancient root, turning his father's tear-stained sketches into a true sanctuary. But it was here in the wilderness that he found an unexpected wild connection and rebuilt his life. This journey from nothing to a masterpiece will warm your soul. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The city air was a stagnant weight, heavy with the scent of hot asphalt and exhaust. Inside the glass-walled penthouse, a clinical light bled onto marble floors, failing to mask the sharp voices of avarice. Outside, the world shimmered in a sweltering haze, indifferent to the broken family within. Jack M. sat in the furthest corner of the room, a silent monolith amidst a storm of greed. At 45, he bore the unmistakable silhouette of a man forged in fires most would never understand. His hazel hair, once the color of deep autumn oak, was now heavily streaked with silver at the temples, a roadmap of the years he had spent navigating the shadows of distant conflicts. A thin, silver-streaked beard framed his jaw, which remained perpetually set in a hard, disciplined line, hiding the tremors of words he chose not to speak. He wore a beige canvas jacket over a matching button shirt, the fabric worn soft by time, and solid dark charcoal chinos that vanished into the sturdy leather of his brown boots. To his siblings, he was a ghost, a broken relic of a war they preferred to forget. But to Jack, they were the ones who were truly lost. He watched them with a quiet, observant intensity, his eyes reflecting a profound weariness that went deeper than bone. Every sharp intake of breath from his sister, or the aggressive thud of his brother's fist on the mahogany table, vibrated through Jack's heightened senses, triggering a phantom echo of the battlefield he carried within his chest, like a hidden shrapnel. Opposite him stood Elias, the eldest of the siblings, and the self-appointed executor of their father's estate. Elias was a man of sharp angles and cold efficiency, his tall frame draped in a bespoke charcoal suit that radiated the sterile authority of a boardroom. His eyes were a flinty gray, perpetually narrowed, as if calculating the hidden cost of every word spoken. At 55, he possessed a hairline that had retreated into a sleek, arrogant widow's peak, and his skin was unnervingly pale, the look of a man who spent his life under fluorescent lights. Elias viewed the world through the lens of profit and loss, his personality defined by a ruthless need for control, a trait that had only intensified after their father's passing. He paced the room with the predatory grace of a man who knew he held the upper hand, his voice a polished blade that sliced through the air. To Elias, the land was not a place of memory. It was a series of squares on a map to be traded for the highest bidder. His greed was not loud. It was a cold, calculated vacuum that sought to pull everything into its center. Beside Elias sat Sarah, the middle sibling, whose elegance was as sharp and fragile as spun glass. She was slender, her early 50s marked by an obsessive adherence to a youthful facade that her tired eyes betrayed. Her hair was a bob of clinical blonde, every strand held in place by a lacquer that mirrored her rigid, uncompromising personality. Sarah's skin was pulled tight over her high cheekbones, and she was adorned with an excessive amount of gold jewelry that clinked like miniature cymbals whenever she moved her restless, manicured hands. She was a woman who lived for status, her sense of self entirely dependent on the perceptions of the city's elite. After a series of social scandals, she had grown increasingly bitter, viewing her father's death not as a tragedy, but as a financial lifeline to secure her precarious social standing. She looked at Jack with a mixture of pity and disdain, unable to comprehend why he sat there in his work clothes while they decided the fate of a fortune. Her soul was a cluttered room of envy and unfulfilled desires, and she clung to the estate as if it were a life raft. At Jack's feet lay Cooper, a sable German shepherd with eyes like burning amber. Cooper was 4 years old, his thick coat a tapestry of black, tan, and silver that seemed to absorb the harsh light of the room. He was a massive creature, his presence providing a silent, grounding anchor for Jack's turbulent mind. Unlike many dogs of his breed, Cooper wore no vest, no harness of service. His bond with Jack was invisible and absolute, forged in the quiet hours of midnight terrors. He was a creature of pure intuition, his ears twitching at the slightest change in Jack's heart rate. When the shouting in the room grew too loud, Cooper would lean his heavy weight against Jack's leg, a warm, living reminder that the present was safe. Cooper's eyes never left his master, sensing the tremors of the past that Jack fought so hard to suppress. The dog was a bridge between the world of men and the world of peace, a sentinel who guarded the fragile borders of Jack's sanity. In Jack's scarred and calloused hands was the only inheritance he truly desired, a tattered, worn leather journal. He held it with a gentleness that bordered on the sacred, his thumb tracing the frayed edges of the cover. This notebook had traveled with him through the mud of trenches and the heat of deserts, a silent witness to his survival. Inside its yellowed pages, amidst the family photographs that had been blurred by rain and time, were the hand-drawn sketches of their father. These were not the blueprints of a professional architect, but the soulful dreams of a man who yearned for a sanctuary he never got to build. The sketches depicted a multi-level home woven into the trees beside a rushing stream, a place where the wind spoke through bamboo and the water washed away the dust of the world. As his siblings argued over the value of city blocks and suburban development, Jack focused on a specific, worthless plot of land in the upper reaches of the wilderness. To Elias and Sarah, it was a liability, a rocky, inaccessible piece of forest that yielded no profit. To Jack, it was the only place where the air felt clean enough to breathe, a place where the ghosts of war might finally find rest. The psychological weight of the room was suffocating. Jack could feel the walls closing in, the voices of his siblings morphing into a dissonant roar in his mind. He closed his eyes for a moment, smelling the faint scent of old pipe tobacco and cedar wood that still lingered in the pages of the journal. He remembered his father's voice, a low rumble like distant thunder, telling him that a man's true home was the place where he could hear his own soul. His siblings' mockery was a dull buzz in the background. Sarah let out a sharp, mocking laugh when Jack finally spoke, his voice low and raspy from years of disuse. "I don't want the skyscrapers or the dividends," Jack said, the words falling like heavy stones into a still pond. "I'll take the land at the headwaters. You can keep the rest." The silence that followed was heavy with confusion. Elias paused his pacing, his gray eyes narrowing in suspicion, trying to find the hidden motive in Jack's surrender of millions. But there was no motive, only a desperate need for the stillness that only that forgotten forest could provide. Jack stood up, the movement fluid and deliberate, a soldier preparing for a final march. He tucked the journal into the inner pocket of his beige jacket, feeling its weight against his heart like a shield. He didn't look back at the polished marble or the clinical light of the city. He didn't look at the faces of the people who shared his blood, but not his spirit. Cooper rose with him, a silent shadow by his side, his amber eyes reflecting the resolve of his master. As they walked toward the door, leaving behind the fragments of a broken family reunion, Jack felt a strange sense of lightness. He wasn't choosing dirt and rocks, he was choosing the only warmth he had ever known, the whispered promise of a father who had dreamed of a sanctuary. He walked out of the penthouse and into the sweltering city heat, his brown boots clicking against the pavement with a new sense of purpose. The worthless land was waiting, and for the first time in a very long time, Jack M. knew exactly where he was going. He was heading toward the river, toward the bamboo, and toward the only version of home that still made sense. The asphalt gave way to gravel, and the gravel eventually surrendered to a narrow, rutted track that groaned under the weight of the old '78 Ford F-150. Jack M. sat behind the wheel, his calloused hands gripping the steering column with the steady, practiced ease of a man who had spent years navigating far more treacherous terrains. The morning air, once thick with the sterile scent of the city, had transformed into a crisp, pine-laden breeze that whipped through the open windows, fluttering the collar of his beige canvas jacket. At 45, the lines around Jack's eyes seemed to settle into a new kind of focus. The weariness of the city penthouse replaced by the sharp, tactical alertness of the field. His His silver-streaked beard caught the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy, and for the first time in years, the phantom weight in his chest felt manageable. He was no longer a ghost in a marble room. He was a man on a mission, returning to a world where the rules were written in stone, water, and shadow. In the passenger seat, Cooper was a whirlwind of uncharacteristic levity. The 4-year-old sable German shepherd, usually a stoic sentinel of Jack's sanity, had succumbed to the infectious energy of the open road. As a patch of sunlight danced across the floor mats, shifting with every turn of the truck, Cooper decided it was an intruder that needed to be neutralized. He spent the better part of an hour pouncing on the flickering shape, his massive paws thudding against the metal, and his amber eyes wide with a playful, goofy intensity. Every missed pounce resulted in a soft, frustrated huff and a rhythmic thumping of his tail against the seat. Jack watched him from the corner of his eye, a rare, genuine smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It was a fleeting glimpse of the life they had both earned, a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy before the arduous labor of the legacy began. However, as the truck crossed the invisible threshold into the deep timberline, the playfulness vanished, as if a command had been whispered in the wind. Cooper's ears pricked forward, his body tensing into a corded mass of muscle. He moved to the window, his nostrils twitching as he cataloged the scent of damp moss, wild game, and the approaching river. The shadow chaser was gone. The K9 guardian had returned. They made one final stop at the edge of the map, a leaning timber structure known as Miller's Post. Standing on the porch was Miller, a man who seemed more like a geological feature than a human being. Miller was nearly 70, his face a deep topographical map of sun-baked wrinkles and white-bearded wisdom. His skin the color of old cedar. He wore a faded denim shirt and heavy canvas trousers. His eyes, a startling clear cornflower blue, possessing the unnerving clarity of someone who had survived the wilderness by listening more than he spoke. Miller was a man of long silences and short, meaningful nods. He didn't ask why a man with a soldier's stare was heading toward the headwaters with nothing but a dog and a truck. He simply helped Jack load a final crate of hardware and a heavy spool of steel cable. As Jack climbed back into the cab, Miller placed a weathered hand on the door, his gaze lingering on Jack's beige shirt and the silver at his temples. "The river remembers the man who respects it," Miller said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. It wasn't a warning, but a benediction. The final leg of the journey took them to the very edge of the limestone cliffs overlooking the rushing stream. This was the plot Elias and Sarah had deemed worthless debris, a jagged protrusion of rock and ancient hemlock that offered no profit to the city-minded. To Jack, it was a natural fortress. He stepped out of the truck, his brown boots crunching on the shale as he surveyed the perimeter. The psychological shift was instantaneous. His mind began to overlay tactical grids onto the landscape, identifying lines of sight, natural egress points, and defensive overhead cover. He wasn't just building a house, he was establishing a base of operations. He chose a recessed shelf beneath a massive overhang of rock, a stone sanctuary that offered protection from the prevailing winds while granting a dominant view of the river approach. The camp construction was a masterclass in military fieldcraft. Jack utilized the truck's winch to drag fallen cedar logs into a reinforced semicircle, creating a windbreak that doubled as a security barrier. He didn't just pitch a tent, he constructed a lean-to using heavy-duty canvas and paracord, tensioned with a precision that would have made a drill sergeant proud. His movements were fluid and economical, a dance of muscle memory that had been dormant but never dead. He dug a tactical fire pit lined with river stones, designed to minimize light signature and prevent the spread of embers into the dry needles of the forest floor. While Jack worked, Cooper was a silent shadow, patrolling the perimeter with a slow, deliberate gait. The dog didn't bark at the squirrels or the rustle of the brush. He merely tilted his head, tracking every movement with a cold, analytical gaze, ensuring the sanctuary remained undisturbed. As the sun began to dip below the jagged horizon, casting long, violet shadows across the cliffside, the camp felt less like a temporary stop and more like a permanent defiance. Jack sat by the small, controlled flame of his fire, the leather journal open on his lap. He traced the lines of his father's sketches of the bamboo house, his mind already calculating the sheer strength of the stalks and the tension required for the lashings. The silent march was no longer a metaphor. It was a physical reality. He felt the cold air of the mountains filling his lungs, washing away the lingering metallic taste of the city's greed. Beside him, Cooper let out a deep, contented sigh and curled his heavy sable body against Jack's leg. They were alone in the wild, miles from the nearest road. But as Jack looked up at the first stars blinking through the hemlocks, he realized he had never been less lonely. The war was far away, and for the first time, the Ding Nguyen, the final wish of his father, felt within reach. The first dawn at the headwaters arrived not with a roar, but with a creeping translucent silver that bled through the heavy canopy of hemlocks and cedar. The air was bitingly cold, a sharp contrast to the stagnant heat of the city Jack M. had left behind, and it carried the primal scent of crushed pine needles and the mineral spray of the rushing river below. Jack stood at the edge of the limestone shelf, his silhouette a hard, disciplined line against the soft morning mist. He was 45, yet the way he moved, every gesture deliberate and economical, suggested a man who had spent a lifetime calculating the cost of every inch of ground. His hazel hair, silvered at the temples like a frost that refused to melt, was tousled by the mountain wind, and his thin silver-streaked beard was damp with the breath of the forest. Clad in his reliable beige canvas jacket over a beige buttoned shirt, with his solid dark charcoal chinos tucked into his sturdy brown boots, he looked less like a vacationer and more like a commander establishing a forward operating base. The psychological fog of the city had lifted, replaced by a singular, driving purpose: to manifest the sketches in the leather journal into a living, breathing sanctuary of bamboo and stone. The labor began with the harvest, and Jack approached it with the grim, calculated precision of a combat engineer. He didn't just swing his machete. He analyzed the grain of the timber and the vertical tension of the bamboo stalks that grew in dense emerald thickets along the lower bank. He utilized leverage and gravity, marking each cut with a surveyor's eye to ensure the integrity of the material for the structural frames. Each stroke of the blade was a rhythmic thud that echoed against the canyon walls, a sound that felt both productive and dangerously familiar to his ears. In the deep silence of the wilderness, the repetitive strike of metal against wood began to sync with the steady drumbeat of his own heart, and for a moment, the emerald leaves of the forest threatened to morph into the suffocating jungle canopies of his past. The weight of the machete in his hand felt too much like the weight of a rifle, and the sweat stinging his eyes carried the salt of distant, dust-choked battles he had tried so hard to bury. His breathing deepened into a heavy, mechanical rhythm, his vision narrowing until the bamboo before him wasn't just wood, but an obstacle to be cleared in a landscape haunted by shadows. But Jack was never truly alone in the descent toward his internal shadows. Cooper, the 4-year-old sable German shepherd, was a sentinel of the soul as much as he was a guardian of the physical camp. Sensing the subtle shift in Jack's posture, the way his shoulders went rigid and his eyes lost their focus on the present, Cooper initiated his own mission. The dog, whose thick coat of black, tan, and silver seemed to shimmer in the dappled morning light, trotted into the tall grass and emerged with a ragged, mud-caked tennis ball he had unearthed from the truck. He didn't just drop it. He lunged at Jack's legs, nudging the man's charcoal chinos with a wet nose and a series of insistent, high-pitched huffs. When Jack didn't immediately respond, Cooper went further, trotting to the camp and dragging an old, discarded leather boot toward the harvesting site. He dropped the heavy footwear right onto Jack's brown boots, looking up with amber eyes that held a playful, demanding intelligence. It was a calculated disruption, a forced interjection of innocence that broke the dangerous spiral of the 1,000-yard stare. Jack blinked, the phantom sounds of rotors and gunfire fading into the rush of the river, and he looked down at his loyal companion, the tension finally draining from his jaw. By midday, a new presence moved through the periphery of the woods, a silent observer whose footsteps were as light as falling leaves. Mara, a local forager who lived in a small cabin miles downstream, stepped into the clearing with a quiet grace that didn't startle the alert dog. Mara was a woman in her late 60s, her skin tanned to the color of cured leather and etched with fine lines that spoke of a life spent in open air. Her silver hair was plaited into a single thick braid that reached her waist, and she wore a worn denim apron over a heavy wool sweater. Mara was a woman of earth and herb, possessing a personality that was both blunt and deeply empathetic. She had seen many broken men come to these mountains seeking refuge, but few who brought the structural discipline Jack displayed. She carried a basket of wild ramps and dried medicinal mushrooms, her cornflower blue eyes taking in the fortified camp with a quiet understanding. She didn't speak at first, merely nodding toward the bamboo frames Jack had begun to lash together with steel cable. To Mara, Jack was a builder of defenses, a man trying to cage his own grief within the geometry of bamboo and stone. Jack acknowledged her with a curt, respectful nod, his military training dictating a cautious but civil engagement with the local inhabitant. Mara set a small bundle of herbs near the fire pit, a silent offering for the soldier who builds in the dark. She spoke only once, her voice a mellow, resonant hum that seemed to match the frequency of the forest itself. "The wood will hold the roof, son, but the dog will hold the man," she said, her gaze resting briefly on Cooper, who had finally convinced Jack to sit for a 5-minute reprieve. Mara's presence was a reminder that even in his chosen exile, there were threads of human connection that couldn't be entirely severed. She represented a different kind of strength than the avarice of Elias or the fragility of Sarah. She was the resilience of the forest itself, weathered but unbroken by the seasons. As she disappeared back into the shadows of the hemlocks, Jack felt the weight of her words settle into the marrow of his bones, a tactical truth he hadn't yet dared to admit to himself. The afternoon was a grueling test of physical and mental endurance. Jack began the process of building under the rock, integrating the natural limestone overhang into the structural support of the sanctuary. He used a primitive pulley system, anchored to the massive hemlock roots, to hoist the heavy bamboo pillars into place with agonizing slowness. Every knot was tied with paracord, tightened with a force that made the fibers groan against the wood. He was building a stone sanctuary, a fortress of memory that had to be as impenetrable as his own resolve. Whenever the physical exhaustion threatened to let the nightmares slip through the cracks of his focus, Cooper was there. The dog would suddenly sprint in wide, exuberant circles around the building site, barking at nothing and everything, forcing Jack to laugh at the sheer, unbridled absurdity of a canine warrior acting like a puppy. Cooper was a bridge, a living tether that kept Jack from drifting too far into the sea of what used to be. As the sun began to descend, painting the limestone in hues of burnt orange and deep violet, the first skeletal frame of the sanctuary stood proudly against the cliff. It was a structure of military efficiency and poetic intent, a fusion of his father's dream and Jack's survival instinct. The axe of memory had done its work, not by cutting away the past, but by shaping it into something that could finally provide shelter. Jack sat by the Riverstone fire pit, the heat radiating against his beige jacket, his hand resting on the broad, warm head of the sable German shepherd. The leather journal lay open to a page where his father had sketched a porch overlooking the rapids, the very porch Jack was now standing on. The silence was no longer an enemy. It was a companion. In the deep blue of the twilight, the river's song grew louder, a persistent, cleansing roar that seemed to wash the soot of war from Jack's spirit. He looked at the calloused palms of his hands, stained with bamboo sap and dirt, and felt a profound, quiet victory. He hadn't just harvested wood. He had harvested a day of peace. The morning air hung heavy and silver over the headwaters, a thick veil of humidity that clung to the partially finished bamboo rafters of the sanctuary like a damp shroud. The rushing river below provided a constant rhythmic roar that muffled the smaller sounds of the waking forest, creating a sensory bubble where Jack M. felt both isolated and strangely protected. He stood on the limestone shelf, his hazel hair dampened by the mist and his silver-streaked beard catching the first pale rays of a sun that struggled to pierce the canopy. Clad in his reliable beige canvas jacket over a beige buttoned shirt, with his solid dark charcoal chinos tucked into his brown boots, Jack moved with a quiet, deliberate focus as he checked the tension of the paracord lashings he had completed the night before. His calloused hands, stained with the emerald sap of the bamboo he had harvested under the watchful eyes of Mara, felt a phantom ache. a dull reminder of the physical cost of building a legacy on the edge of a cliff. Beside him, Cooper was far from the playful, shadow-chasing dog of the journey or the ball-obsessed companion of the harvest. The 4-year-old sable German shepherd stood as rigid as the limestone itself, his amber eyes fixed on a dense thicket of mountain laurel at the periphery of the clearing. A low, guttural vibration emanated from his chest, not a bark of aggression, but a professional warning of a superior predator's approach. The thicket parted with a heavy, wet snap, and out stepped a creature that seemed to have been carved from the very shadows of the deep timber. He was a massive black bear, a titan of the great forest, standing nearly 7 feet tall when he shifted his weight onto his haunches. His fur was a dense, matted tapestry of midnight black, though a distinct ragged chevron of silver hair marked his chest, giving him the appearance of a decorated general in a forgotten war. He was old, perhaps 20 years of age, and his muzzle was scarred from decades of territorial disputes and survival in a world that was shrinking around him. However, it was not his size that froze the air in Jack's lungs. It was the heavy rusted steel of a poacher's trap that was clamped ruthlessly onto his left hind leg. The metal teeth had bitten deep into the muscle, and a trailing length of broken chain clattered against the stones, with a sound that was jarringly industrial against the symphony of the wild. The bear's breathing was a series of ragged, pained huffs, and his eyes, dark, ancient orbs filled with a terrifying mixture of agony and defiance, locked onto Jack with a desperate intensity. In that moment, Jack didn't see a beast. He saw a reflection of himself, a wounded soldier trapped by a mechanism he didn't create, struggling to find a way to exist in a world that only knew how to hurt. The tension in the clearing was a physical weight, a tactical stalemate where one wrong move would ignite a bloodbath. Jack's military training took over, his mind automatically calculating the distance, the threat level, and the window of engagement. He knew he could reach for the rifle in the truck, but the thought felt like a betrayal of the sanctuary he was trying to build. He looked at the bear's mangled limb and felt a sharp, sympathetic sting in his own scars. "Easy, big fella," Jack whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that held no fear, only a profound, weary empathy. He signaled to Cooper with a subtle hand gesture, a distract but don't engage command they had perfected in the field. Cooper, the master of K9 intuition, began a slow, deliberate circle around the bear, keeping a safe 15-foot radius. He didn't growl or snap. He simply became a moving target, drawing the bear's primary focus away from Jack and onto the shimmering black and tan fur of the shepherd. It was a masterclass in battlefield choreography, the dog providing the necessary diversion for the medic to move in. Jack reached for his military-grade first aid kit and a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters he had used for the bamboo lashings. Every step toward the Titan was a gamble with his life. The bear let out a thunderous, rib-shaking roar that sent a flock of ravens screaming from the hemlocks, but Jack didn't flinch. He recognized the sound not as a threat, but as a scream for help. He knelt in the damp moss, just feet from the massive paws, and began the grueling process of battlefield surgery on a king. The rusted steel teeth were stubborn, holding on with a spiteful grip, but Jack worked with the calm, methodical precision of a man who had pulled shrapnel from his own brothers in the mud of distant trenches. He used a thick bamboo slat as a pry bar, easing the pressure just enough to slip the bolt cutters onto the hinge. With a sharp, metallic crack that echoed like a gunshot, the trap shattered. The relief was instantaneous. The bear's massive frame slumped slightly, the terrifying tension in its muscles giving way to a profound exhaustion. But the work wasn't done. The wound was a jagged mess of torn fur and infection, and Jack knew that without intervention, the guest wouldn't survive the week. He reached into his kit, pulling out a bottle of antiseptic and a heavy-duty antibiotic spray intended for trauma. As the cool liquid hit the raw flesh, the bear swung its massive head around, its hot breath smelling of wild berries and decay clouding Jack's vision. For a heartbeat, Jack's life hung by a thread, the bear's teeth inches from his throat. But then, something miraculous happened. The bear's eyes softened, the frantic red-rim panic replaced by a silent, knowing recognition. It was a truce born of mutual pain. Jack worked quickly, cleaning the debris and applying a thick layer of medical-grade sealant. He felt the coarse, wiry texture of the fur and the incredible heat emanating from the animal's body. A living, breathing furnace of nature. Throughout the ordeal, Cooper remained the perfect sentinel, his amber eyes never leaving the bear, a silent guardian ensuring that the peace remained unbroken. When the final bandage was secured, a makeshift wrap of heavy-duty gauze and paracord, Jack stepped back, his beige jacket stained with the dark blood of the Forest King. He felt a strange, light-headed sense of accomplishment, a victory that felt more significant than any medal he had ever been awarded. The bear stood up slowly, testing the weight on its injured leg with a series of cautious, limping steps. It turned to look at Jack one last time, a long, lingering gaze that felt like a bridge across the chasm between species. There was no growl, no roar, only a silent, dignified acknowledgement of a life saved. The Forest King turned and vanished back into the emerald shadows of the hemlocks, the chain no longer clattering, leaving only a few drops of blood on the limestone as a testament to the encounter. Jack sat down on a nearby cedar log, his legs finally shaking as the adrenaline ebbed away. He looked at his hands, calloused and scarred, and realized that in healing the guest, he had managed to stitch together a small piece of his own shattered spirit. As the evening shadows began to stretch across the limestone sanctuary, the river seemed to sing with a new, deeper resonance. Mara stepped out from behind a massive hemlock, having watched the entire encounter from the safety of the trees. She didn't offer praise, she simply handed Jack a bundle of fresh moss and yarrow to clean the blood from his jacket. "He won't forget, son," she said, her voice a mellow hum that blended with the wind. "The mountain has a long memory for those who choose mercy over the rifle." Jack nodded silently, leaning his head against Cooper's warm flank. The guest of the great forest had left, but the respect remained, a silent vow between the soldier and the wild. The sanctuary was no longer just a house of bamboo. It was becoming a place where even the most broken kings could find a moment of peace. The morning light at the headwaters had changed. It was no longer a harsh clinical intrusion, but a soft, amber glow that seemed to dance off the rushing blue river below, illuminating the limestone sanctuary with a quiet, holy intensity. Jack M. stood in the center of the skeletal frame he had spent weeks raising, the leather journal of his father held open in his scarred, calloused hands. At 45, the physical toll of the construction was etched into the lines of his face, yet his hazel eyes, silver-streaked at the temples by the frost of his memories, held a clarity that had been missing for decades. He was dressed in his reliable beige canvas jacket over a beige buttoned shirt, his solid dark charcoal chinos, stained now with the dust of limestone and the sap of emerald bamboo, tucked firmly into his brown boots. He looked from the tattered yellowed sketches in the journal to the physical reality rising around him. The drawings weren't just blueprints, they were a conversation across time, a bridge of ink and paper that guided Jack's every move. The ghost of his father, Silas, felt less like a haunting and more like a steady hand on his shoulder as Jack began the intricate task of laying the flooring. He didn't use power tools or modern fasteners. Instead, he relied on the primitive wisdom of the forest and the survival skills he had honed in the mud of distant theaters. The floor was a labor of surgical precision. Jack spent hours splitting the thickest bamboo stalks into uniform slats, using a heavy-duty machete to peel away the outer husk until the pale, resilient core was exposed. He laid them side by side, creating a rhythmic pattern of textures that looked like the scales of a sleeping dragon. To connect the pillars and the joists, Jack employed a complex system of military-grade paracord lashings. Not a single nail was driven into the wood. He used Japanese square knots and diagonal lashings, pulling the cord with a force that made his muscles scream, ensuring that the tension itself became the glue that held the sanctuary together. This method allowed the structure to breathe and flex with the mountain winds rather than resisting them, a tactical lesson in resilience that Jack applied to his own spirit. Every time he tightened a knot, he felt a bit of the internal static, the soot of war, being squeezed out of his mind. The house was becoming a physical manifestation of his father's dream, a place where the wind spoke through bamboo and the river washed away the past. As the first section of the floor was secured, Cooper, the 4-year-old sable German shepherd, decided that his role as sentinel needed to expand into quality control. Usually, Cooper stood as a stoic guardian, his amber eyes scanning the brush for any sign of the forest king or other intruders. But the moment the bamboo planks were in place, the dog's professional demeanor vanished. He would leap onto the new flooring with an exuberant zoomy, his thick coat of black, tan, and silver shimmering in the sunlight as he ran in tight, frantic circles like a furry whirlwind. His massive paws thudded against the bamboo, testing the strength of Jack's lashings with a chaotic energy that forced Jack to stop and laugh, a sound that was becoming less of a stranger in this wilderness. Cooper would stop abruptly, his head tilted to one side, as if listening for a creak or a groan in the wood, then look up at Jack with a wag of his tail that said, "It holds." This playful ritual became the heartbeat of their work, a reminder that the sanctuary was being built not just for survival, but for life. By the third afternoon, a visitor arrived from the lower trail, someone who didn't possess Mara's silent grace, but moved with the heavy rhythmic gait of an old craftsman. Gideon, a man who had been Silas's closest friend and a master carpenter in his own right, stepped into the clearing. Gideon was nearly 75, a towering figure with shoulders that refused to slouch despite the weight of his years. His face was a weathered landscape of deep-set wrinkles, and a voluminous white beard flowed down to his chest, making him look like a mountain spirit in a flannel shirt. He carried a leather tool roll that looked older than Jack, its surface darkened by decades of oil and sweat. Gideon was a man of few words, but his eyes, a piercing, intelligent blue, saw everything. He had spent his life working with wood, and he possessed a personality that was as sturdy and honest as the oak he carved. He had heard rumors in the valley of Silas's boy building on the cliff, and had come to see if the legacy was being honored. Gideon walked to the edge of the bamboo platform, his gaze moving slowly from the paracord knots to the split-slat flooring. He didn't speak for a long time, merely running his gnarled, scarred fingers over a lashing. Jack stood by, his heart beating with a familiar apprehension, waiting for the judgment of a master. Finally, Gideon looked up, a small, knowing smile breaking through his white beard. "Your father always said nails were for men who didn't trust the wood," Gideon said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble like stones grinding together in a riverbed. "You've built this the way a soldier builds a bridge, to take the weight of the world." He reached into his tool roll and pulled out a small, hand-carved wooden mallet made of ironwood. "Silas made this for you when you were 10. He said you'd need it when you finally decided to come home." The gift was more than a tool. It was a final piece of the puzzle, a physical link to a father who had known, even then, that his son would one day need to build a sanctuary to survive his own memories. The presence of Gideon brought a new dimension to the build. While Jack provided the tactical strength, Gideon offered the seasoned wisdom of the craft. They worked in a silent, productive harmony, the only sounds being the clack-clack of bamboo and the occasional bark from Cooper as he performed his whirlwind inspections. Jack realized that he was no longer just building under a rock. He was integrating himself into a lineage of builders and dreamers. The bamboo sanctuary was growing, its multi-level terraces beginning to overlook the rushing Blue River with a sense of majestic permanence. It was a structure born of war-honed skills, but dedicated to peace. As the sun set on the final day of the flooring installation, the house stood as a testament to the power of Dinguyen, the final wish. Jack sat on the newly finished porch, his hand on Cooper's warm head, looking out over the rapids. The worthless land was now the most valuable place on earth, a home built from the old pages of a father's love. The morning had begun with a profound, sacred silence that only the deep wilderness could provide, a silence that Jack M. had spent weeks carefully cultivating within the bamboo walls of his sanctuary. He stood on the upper terrace, the split bamboo floor smooth beneath his brown boots, looking out over the rushing Blue River that surged against the limestone cliffs below. At 45, the physical labor had hardened his frame, and the silver at his temples seemed to catch the morning light like a badge of endurance. He was dressed in his reliable beige canvas jacket over a beige buttoned shirt, his solid dark charcoal chinos, the same pair he had worn since arriving, now bearing the honorable stains of mud and limestone dust. Beside him, Cooper, the 4-year-old sable German shepherd, was a living statue of amber-eyed vigilance, his thick coat shimmering in the dappled sunlight. For a brief flickering moment, Jack felt as though he had finally outrun the ghosts of his past. The silent march had led him here, to a home built not of bricks and greed, but of memory and bamboo. But the peace was shattered by a sound that didn't belong to the mountains, the distant rhythmic roar of heavy engines. Jack's military instincts, dormant but never dead, flared to life. He moved to the edge of the balcony, his jaw setting into a hard, disciplined line as he watched a cloud of gray dust rise from the lower trail. 3 high-end black SUVs, their polished surfaces reflecting the sun like armor, groaned up the rutted track that Miller had warned was nearly impassable. The engines died with a sequence of electronic chirps that felt like an assault on the forest's symphony. As the dust settled, the doors opened, and a vision of the life Jack had abandoned stepped out onto the rocky shale. Elias was the first to emerge, his bespoke charcoal suit looking absurdly out of place against the ancient hemlocks. He adjusted his silk tie with a gesture of cold, practiced authority, his flinty gray eyes narrowing as he surveyed the cliffside. Behind him came Sarah, her slender frame draped in a designer trench coat that cost more than Jack's truck. Her bob of clinical blonde hair remained unmoved by the mountain breeze, and she stepped cautiously onto the dirt, her heels sinking into the soft earth. She clutched a designer handbag as if it were a shield, her face twisted in a mask of visible disdain. Between them stood a man Jack had never seen, Mr. Sterling, the lead legal counsel for a multinational mining conglomerate. Mr. Sterling was a man of sterile, razor-sharp edges, a human manifestation of a corporate contract. He was in his early 40s, with raven black hair slicked back with a precision that defied the humidity, and rimless glasses that glinted with a cold, analytical light. He wore a navy blue suit that seemed to repel the natural world, and he carried a sleek, carbon fiber briefcase with the air of a man who dealt in the destruction of landscapes. Sterling's skin was unnaturally smooth, and his personality was a void of empathy, replaced by a ruthless commitment to the bottom line. He didn't look at the beauty of the river. He looked at the ground beneath his feet, as if he could see through the limestone to the riches buried below. "Jack," Elias called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls with an unearned familiarity. He didn't wait for an invitation. He began the climb toward the bamboo sanctuary, followed by Sarah and a small phalanx of junior lawyers. As they reached the main deck, Sarah's gold jewelry clinked with every step, the sound jarring against the rustle of the leaves. She stopped at the threshold, her eyes scanning the intricate bamboo joinery and the paracord lashings with a mocking sneer. "Good heavens, Jack," she said, her voice dripping with a poisonous pity. "We heard you were playing pioneer, but we didn't realize you were living in a... What is this? A madman's hut? A glorified bird's nest?" Jack didn't move. He stood with his arms crossed, his presence a silent, immovable monolith. Cooper moved to his side, a low, guttural vibration beginning in the dog's chest, a warning that the sanctuary was occupied by a superior predator. Elias ignored the dog, stepping onto the bamboo floor with a heavy, disrespectful tread. He pulled a thick stack of legal documents from Sterling's briefcase and slapped them onto a hand-carved cedar table Gideon had helped Jack finish. "Enough with the theatrics, Jack," Elias snapped, his calculating gray eyes locking onto Jack's hazel gaze. "You've had your fun in the dirt, but reality has caught up with you. A geological survey by Sterling's firm has confirmed a massive vein of rare gemstones, blue sapphires of incredible purity, running directly beneath this riverbank." Sterling stepped forward, his voice a flat, mechanical drone. "Mr. M, the mineral rights on this specific plot were never fully severed in the original deed. My clients are prepared to offer you a significant settlement to vacate the premises immediately. If you refuse, we are prepared to file for eminent domain on the basis of economic development for the state. This structure you've built, well, it's a code violation at best and an eyesore at worst. It certainly won't stand in the way of a multi-billion-dollar extraction project." Sarah walked to the edge of the balcony, looking down at the rushing blue river with an expression of pure avarice. "Don't you see, Jack? This worthless rock is finally worth something. You can come back to the city, buy a real house, and stop this embarrassing charade. Look at yourself. You look like a common laborer. You're a disgrace to the family name, hiding out here with a dog and some sticks." She reached out a manicured hand to touch a bamboo pillar, but Cooper let out a sharp, decisive bark that made her jump back, her heels clattering on the slats. Jack felt the old roar of the battlefield beginning to rise in his chest, the familiar, dangerous heat of a man pushed into a corner. He looked at Elias's cold, triumphant smirk and Sarah's greedy, status-obsessed eyes. He thought of the forest king he had healed, the sweat he had poured into every paracord knot, and the quiet wisdom Mara and Gideon had shared with him. These people didn't see a home. They saw a commodity. They didn't see a sanctuary. They saw a barrier to profit. The psychological weight of their presence was suffocating, a synthetic invasion into the only place where he had found peace. Without a word, Jack's hand moved unconsciously to the inner pocket of his beige jacket. He felt the rough, familiar texture of the leather journal, the only inheritance that mattered. He remembered his father's sketches, the dreams of a man who knew that some things are too precious to be measured in the carats or dividends. The journal was his anchor, a reminder that he wasn't just defending a piece of land. He was defending a soul. He looked at the legal papers on the table, then back at the city dwellers who had come to steal his silence. "You call this a madman's hut," Jack finally said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate with the power of the river itself. "But my father called it a dream, and unlike your gemstones, a dream can't be mined." He reached out and picked up the papers, his callous thumb brushing against the sterile ink. "You've spent your whole lives looking for value in things you can sell, but you've forgotten how to value the things you can't." Elias's face darkened, his gray eyes turning to ice. "Don't be a fool, Jack. You can't fight a corporation with a dog and a notebook. You have 48 hours to sign those papers, or we'll return with the sheriff and a demolition crew. This sanctuary is coming down, whether you're in it or not." As they turned to leave, the clinking of Sarah's jewelry and the electronic chirps of their SUVs felt like a fading poison. Jack stood on his balcony, his hands still gripped around the journal, watching the dust rise once more. The invasion of reality had arrived, but the soldier wasn't retreating. He looked down at Cooper, whose amber eyes were fixed on the retreating cars, and felt a new, tactical resolve. The house was finished, but the battle for the sanctuary had only just begun. The afternoon sky above the headwaters did not merely darken, it bruised, turning a deep, sickly shade of violet and charcoal as the humidity reached a suffocating breaking point. The air, once filled with the scent of pine and blue water, grew heavy with the metallic tang of ozone and the thick, cloying smell of churned earth. A low, rhythmic rumble that wasn't thunder began to vibrate through the limestone shelf, the sound of the river gorging itself on a torrential downpour far up in the mountain peaks. Jack M. stood on the upper terrace of his sanctuary, his beige canvas jacket damp with the first heavy, aggressive droplets of rain. His hazel eyes, sharp and analytical, watched the horizon with a soldier's dread. At 45, he knew that nature, much like war, rarely gave warnings before it struck. Beside him, Cooper, the 4-year-old sable German shepherd, stood with his ears pinned back, his amber eyes fixed on the surging water below. The dog's low, guttural vibration was no longer directed at human intruders. It was a warning to the very earth itself, as the first wall of the flash flood crested the upstream bend. The black SUVs of Elias and Sarah were struggling to retreat down the rutted track when the disaster truly began. The small wooden bridge, the only umbilical cord connecting the sanctuary to the outside world, creaked under the immense pressure of a rising tide of debris, mud, and uprooted timber. Elias stood outside his vehicle, his bespoke charcoal suit now plastered to his trembling frame, his face a mask of frantic city-bred terror, as he watched the bridge foundations shudder and groan. Sarah was trapped on the far bank, her clinical blonde bob ruined by the deluge, her designer heels abandoned in the slick mud as she clung desperately to a straining hemlock branch. Mr. Sterling and his junior assistant, Thomas, were paralyzed by the sheer, unbridled power of the water. Thomas, a 24-year-old legal clerk with pale, freckled skin and wide, terrified blue eyes, stared at the rising rapids as if he had seen a ghost. He was a boy built for libraries and air-conditioned offices, and his fragile shell of academic arrogance shattered the moment the first wave of cold, brown water surged over the hood of the nearest SUV. With a sound like a freight train derailment, the bridge groaned one last time and vanished into the churning, chocolate-brown maw of the river. The impact sent a spray of icy water and splintered wood into the air, effectively cutting off the retreat of the siblings and their legal entourage. They were stranded on a narrowing spit of land, caught between the sheer limestone cliff and a river that was rising by inches every minute. Elias's voice, once so full of corporate authority, was lost in the deafening roar of the flood. He looked toward the bamboo sanctuary, the madman's hut, with a desperate, pleading gaze. He saw Jack standing on the balcony, a silent monolith in a beige jacket. And for the first time in his life, Elias realized that the worthless rock he had come to steal was the only thing that could save his life. The arrogance of the city had been washed away, replaced by the primal realization of their own mortality. Jack didn't hesitate. The moment the bridge vanished, the silent march transformed into a high-stakes combat rescue. He moved with the fluid, mechanical precision of a combat engineer, his brown boots gripping the wet bamboo slats as he sprinted to the supply cache Gideon had helped him organize. He wasn't just a man in a forest. He was a specialist in survival. He hauled out a heavy spool of military-grade climbing rope and a series of hand-carved bamboo pulleys he had integrated into the sanctuary's support beams for hoisting heavy materials. His mind, honed by years of battlefield logistics, calculated the tension, the angles of descent, and the force of the current with a speed that left no room for doubt. He slammed a steel carabiner into a rooted anchor point, his scarred hands working with a rhythmic, disciplined grace that commanded the attention of the terrified people below. "Cooper, take the line!" Jack shouted, his voice a low, raspy bark that cut through the thunder of the storm. He handed a light, durable nylon pilot cord to the dog, his gaze locking onto Cooper's with a silent, ironclad vow of trust. The 4-year-old German shepherd didn't hesitate. He gripped the cord in his powerful jaws and plunged into the icy, churning water. Cooper's thick coat of black tan and silver disappeared beneath the brown foam several times, but he fought the current with a relentless canine ferocity. For a heartbeat, Jack's breath hitched in his chest as he watched the dog struggle against a floating cedar log. But Cooper used the eddies to propel himself toward the stranded group. He emerged on the far bank, matted with silt but triumphant, dropping the line at Elias's feet. The dog stood guard, a wet and weary sentinel, as the first of the rescue lines was hauled across the void. One by one, the invaders were strapped into a makeshift bamboo harness Jack had rigged, using his Traverse pulley system. Sarah was the first to cross, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror as she swung over the thundering rapids. She clutched the bamboo spreader bar with a desperate strength, her gold jewelry lost somewhere in the mud, her status-obsessed life reduced to the simple, primal desire for a single breath of air. Jack worked the pulley system with a relentless mechanical force, his muscles bulging beneath his beige shirt, his jaw set in a hard line of focus. He hauled them in, Sarah, Thomas, and finally a shattered Mr. Sterling. They were safe within the walls of the madman's hut, sheltered by the very bamboo they had intended to bulldoze. The clinical light of the city was 1,000,000 miles away, replaced by the warm, flickering glow of the fire pit as the storm continued to rage outside, a testament to the sanctuary's strength and the soldiers' mercy. The roar of the flood had finally settled into a rhythmic, muscular thrum that vibrated through the limestone floor, a constant reminder of the chaos they had all narrowly escaped. Inside the sanctuary, the air was thick with the scent of damp wool, cedar smoke, and the earthy aroma of the Riverstone fire pit that Jack M. had built with such meticulous care. The clinical artificial light of the city felt like a distant, faded memory, replaced by the warm, flickering orange glow that danced across the intricate bamboo rafters. Jack stood near the entrance, his silhouette a hard, disciplined line against the encroaching twilight. He was 45, and the night's rescue had left a fresh layer of exhaustion in the lines around his hazel eyes. Yet he moved with a quiet, purposeful energy. He had shed his wet beige canvas jacket, revealing a matching beige buttoned shirt that was damp but functional, and his solid dark charcoal chinos were tucked into the sturdy leather of his brown boots, which were now caked in a fine layer of limestone silt. Beside him, Cooper, the 4-year-old sable German shepherd, lay with his heavy head resting on his paws, his amber eyes following the movements of the strangers in their midst. The dog's thick coat was still damp, but he remained a silent sentinel, his presence a grounding anchor in the room's heavy emotional atmosphere. Elias sat on a hand-carved cedar bench, his bespoke charcoal suit ruined by the mud and chocolate-brown water of the rapids. He no longer looked like the cold, calculating executor of a multi-million-dollar estate. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized that his authority ended where the wilderness began. His flinty gray eyes were fixed on the fire, his sharp angles softened by a profound, weary contemplation. Beside him, Sarah was wrapped in a heavy hand-woven blanket that smelled of mountain sage and wood smoke. Her clinical blonde bob was a tangled mess of silver and straw, and the gold jewelry that had once clinked like miniature cymbals was gone, lost to the river, or buried in the mud. Her skin, once pulled tight by the vanity of high society, now showed the honest, fragile lines of a woman who had seen the end of her world and survived it. They were safe within the madman's hut they had intended to bulldoze, and the irony of their salvation was a weight that seemed to crush the very words from their throats. The silence was broken only by the crackle of the fire until Sarah's gaze drifted to the hand-carved cedar table Gideon had helped Jack finish. Resting there, open to a well-worn page, was the tattered leather journal that Jack had carried through war and peace. The flickering firelight illuminated the sketches, not as blueprints, but as soulful, hand-drawn dreams of a man named Silas. Sarah stood up, her movements hesitant and shaky, and approached the table as if it were an altar. She looked down at the yellowed pages, her eyes widening as she recognized the drawings. They weren't just sketches of a house. They were a roadmap of a family's lost unity. There were drawings of a multi-level home woven into the trees, but beneath the structural lines were small, handwritten notes in their father's looping script. A room for Elias to find his peace, a porch for Sarah to watch the stars, and a workshop for Jack to build the future. It was a sanctuary designed for all of them, a dream Silas had whispered to them when they were children, a dream that Jack alone had remembered and spent his blood and sweat to realize. Elias joined her at the table, his gray eyes narrowing as he read the words of a father he had spent years trying to quantify in terms of acreage and mineral rights. The realization hit him like the cold spray of the river. This worthless rock was the physical manifestation of a love he had long ago traded for profit. His hand trembled as he reached out to touch the frayed edges of the journal, the leather soft and scarred, like the man who now stood as their protector. As they looked around the sanctuary, the details they had previously mocked as code violations began to take on a sacred significance. They saw the paracord lashings not as crude ties, but as the bonds of a soldier who knew how to hold things together when the world was falling apart. They saw the split bamboo flooring not as a bird's nest, but as a resilient path built to withstand the seasons of life. A new presence moved quietly through the shadows of the porch. Lila, the 19-year-old granddaughter of Gideon, who had arrived with a basket of warm bread and medicinal teas. Lila was lithe and graceful, like a willow tree that thrived in the wind. Her skin was sun-kissed, and her wild auburn hair was tied back with a simple leather thong. She had a personality that was both observant and shy, inheriting her grandfather's intuitive understanding of the land and the people who sought refuge upon it. She wore a simple canvas apron over a wool sweater, her green eyes reflecting the warmth of the fire. She moved among the guests with a silent efficiency, offering the bread as a gesture of mountain hospitality that required no words. Lila was a child of the headwaters, a reminder that life continued here with a simple, honest dignity that the city had long ago forgotten. Her presence was a bridge between the old wisdom of Miller and Mara and the new reality Jack was forging. As the siblings explored the inner sanctum of the house, Jack remained by the door, his hand resting on the broad head of his German shepherd. He didn't offer explanations or seek apologies. His work spoke for itself. He watched as Elias walked toward one of the massive bamboo pillars that supported the central roof. The elder brother stopped, his breath catching in his throat as he saw the wood more closely. Carved carefully into the emerald husk of the bamboo, at eye level, was his own name, Elias. He moved to the next pillar and found Sarah, and then the next, where Jack and Silas were etched into the grain. Jack hadn't just built a house. He had carved their names into the very heart of the sanctuary, ensuring that even in their absence, they were a part of the dream. Each pillar was a monument to a person Silas had loved, a silent vow that the family would always have an anchor, no matter how far the river of life carried them away. Regret, heavy and suffocating, began to invade the room. Sarah let out a small, broken sob as she touched the carving of her name. She realized that, while she had been obsessed with status and jewelry, her brother had been building her a place to watch the stars. Elias stood before his pillar, his hand covering the carved letters, his head bowing in a rare gesture of humility. The greed that had fueled their invasion felt hollow, a ghost that vanished in the presence of such absolute, selfless dedication. They had called him a madman, a relic of a war they wanted to forget. But they now saw that he was the only one among them who had truly understood the value of their father's legacy. The gemstones Sterling sought beneath the silt were pebbles compared to the treasure of the worthless rock they were standing upon. As the night deepened and the storm outside finally died down to a soft, persistent drizzle, the family sat together around the fire pit. Mr. Sterling and Thomas remained in the shadows, silent and humbled by the display of a power they couldn't litigate or extract. Jack sat with his siblings, the leather journal finally back in his pocket, resting against his heart. The invasion of reality had been met with a deeper truth, that the strongest structures are built from the fragments of a broken heart. Sarah leaned her head against Jack's shoulder, her blonde hair damp against his beige shirt, and for the first time in decades, the silence between them wasn't a weapon. It was a sanctuary. The behind the sketches wasn't just about the house. It was about the man who had the courage to build it. As the first pale light of a new dawn began to touch the limestone cliffs, Jack M. knew that the march was far from over, but for the first time, he wasn't marching alone. Night had fallen over the headwaters like a heavy velvet curtain, draped in a profound stillness that only the deep wilderness can possess after a great storm. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of damp stone and the cleansing fragrance of cedar smoke that curled lazily from the river stone hearth. Inside the bamboo sanctuary, the orange glow of the fire cast long, dancing shadows against the intricate joinery and the hand-carved pillars where the siblings' names were etched in the emerald grain. Jack M. sat near the edge of the terrace, his silhouette a hard, disciplined line against the encroaching dark. At 45, the physical and emotional weight of the past weeks had settled into a quiet strength, his hazel eyes reflecting the flickering flames with a clarity born of survival. He was dressed in his reliable beige canvas jacket over a beige buttoned shirt, his solid dark charcoal chinos bearing the honorable stains of his labor, and his brown boots resting firmly on the split bamboo floor. Beside him, Cooper, the 4-year-old sable German shepherd, was a living statue of amber-eyed vigilance, his thick coat of black, tan, and silver shimmering in the firelight as he rested his heavy head on Jack's knee. The fragile peace of the room was suddenly punctuated by a low, guttural vibration from Cooper's chest. Not a bark of alarm, but a respectful acknowledgement of a peer. A massive shadow detached itself from the obsidian darkness of the hemlocks, moving with a silent, heavy grace onto the limestone shelf just beyond the porch. It was the Forest King, the massive black bear with the silver chevron on his chest, whom Jack had saved from the steel trap. The titan of the great forest stood nearly 7 feet tall, his dark, ancient orbs reflecting the hearth's glow as he tested the air with a scarred muzzle. Sarah let out a sharp, strangled gasp, her hand flying to her throat where her gold jewelry had once been, while Elias froze on his cedar bench, his flinty gray eyes widening in primal terror. Mr. Sterling and the young clerk, Thomas, scrambled backward, their city-bred nerves shattering at the sight of the apex predator so close to their fragile refuge. But as they looked at Jack, they saw no fear. Jack didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he leaned back, his hand remaining steady on Cooper's head. He reached into a leather pouch and tossed a thick piece of dried venison onto the stones. The bear lowered its massive head, accepted the offering with a dignified huff, and then simply sat, a silent guardian watching over the house of bamboo. The presence of the bear, rather than bringing violence, seemed to act as a catalyst for the final collapse of the siblings' corporate armor. The invasion of reality that had brought Elias and Sarah here with legal threats and talk of gemstones now felt like a fever dream from a different lifetime. The soggy, illegible legal documents at the bottom of the river were no longer a concern. In the presence of the Forest King and the man who had healed him, the pursuit of profit felt hollow, a heavy weight that Elias was finally ready to set down. He looked at the carved pillar bearing his own name, and then at Jack, his voice a low, gravelly rasp when he finally spoke. "I remember now," Elias said, his gray eyes softening with a rare, honest vulnerability. "The camping trip to the Black Ridge when I was 10. Dad stayed up all night keeping the fire going because I was afraid of the dark. He told me that a man's strength isn't in what he owns, but in what he protects." Sarah moved closer to the fire, the rough wool blanket Jack had provided wrapped tightly around her slender frame. Her blonde hair was a mess of straw and silver, but the sharpness in her face had been replaced by a quiet, reflective grace. "He drew this house for us even then, didn't he?" she whispered, her gaze drifting to the open journal on the table. "I had forgotten the smell of the pine and the way the river sounds at night. I spent so many years trying to buy the things I thought would make me happy, but I never felt as safe as I do right now, in this bird's nest on a rock." The siblings began to share stories they had buried under decades of avarice, memories of their father's laughter, the way he would sketch on napkins at diners, and the quiet, fierce love he had for the three of them. The axe of memory was no longer cutting into Jack's trauma. It was carving a new path for all of them. To add a final touch of domestic warmth to the mythological night, Lila arrived from the upper trail, this time carrying a small, lidded basket that emitted a series of indignant mews. She stepped into the firelight, her auburn hair loose and her green eyes dancing with amusement as she introduced the final member of their makeshift family, Jasper. Jasper was a 10-year-old tuxedo cat with a missing left ear and a personality that was entirely unimpressed by the presence of a 7-foot bear or a combat-trained German shepherd. Lila set him down, and the cat immediately trotted over to the hearth, claimed the warmest spot on the bamboo floor, and began a rhythmic, thrumming purr that seemed to sync with the river's song. Jasper was a creature of absolute comfort and survival, a small, furry testament to the resilience of life in the mountains. Even Mr. Sterling, the corporate lawyer, found himself reaching out a trembling hand to stroke the cat's scarred head, the razor-sharp edges of his personality finally beginning to blunt. As the night deepened, the conversation drifted from the past to the future. They didn't speak of mining or eminent domain. Instead, they spoke of the Conservation Trust, Dr. Eris Thorne had mentioned, a way to ensure that the worthless land remained a sanctuary for generations to come. Elias and Sarah, once the invaders, were now becoming the protectors, their city-honed skills repurposed to defend the dream they had almost destroyed. The sanctuary was no longer just Jack's hideout. It was the family's anchor. Jack looked at his siblings, at Lila and her grandfather Gideon, who watched from the shadows, and at the two warriors, the dog and the bear, who guarded the borders of their peace. He realized that his father's Dinguyen, his final wish, wasn't just for a house of wood and stone. It was for a homecoming of the heart. In the final hour before dawn, the Forest King rose, gave one last dignified nod toward the porch, and vanished back into the emerald shadows of the hemlocks. The river's song remained constant, a persistent cleansing roar that had washed the soot of war and greed from their collective spirits. Jack stood on the balcony, his hand on Cooper's warm head, watching the first pale light of a new day touch the limestone cliffs. The silent march had ended, but a new journey was beginning. He tucked the leather journal into his beige jacket, feeling its weight against his heart, not as a burden, but as a compass. They were miles from the world of men, but for the first time in 45 years, Jack M. was exactly where he was meant to be. The fragments of the Union had been gathered, the sanctuary was complete, and under the bamboo roof, the soldier had finally found his home. The morning light that washed over the headwaters was no longer a harsh intrusion, but a soft, liquid gold that seemed to celebrate the stillness of the limestone cliffs. The river below had returned to its brilliant sapphire blue, its roar transformed into a steady, comforting pulse that signaled the end of the storm and the beginning of a lasting peace. Jack M. stood on the wide bamboo porch of his completed sanctuary, breathing in the scent of damp earth, cedar smoke, and the wild, untainted air of a world preserved. At 45, the hardness in his face had settled into a look of profound contentment, the silver at his temples reflecting the sun like a badge of a war finally won. He was dressed in his signature beige canvas jacket over a matching buttoned shirt. His solid dark charcoal chinos, now a permanent part of his identity, tucked into the sturdy leather of his brown boots. The calluses on his hands were no longer marks of toil, but symbols of creation. Beside him, Cooper, the 4-year-old sable German shepherd, lay with his chin resting on his massive paws, his amber eyes following a hawk circling high above. The dog was no longer just a sentinel. He was the co-author of this piece, a warrior who had found his own version of a garden. Inside the house, Jasper the tuxedo cat sat on a sunlit slat of bamboo, his missing ear twitching as he watched the play of light on the water. The legal battle that had once threatened to tear the mountain apart had dissolved into the mist of the valley. Under Jack's quiet but firm leadership, and with the strategic guidance of Dr. Eris Thorne, the worthless land had not been sold to the mining conglomerate. Instead, it had been officially deeded as the Silas M. Family Wilderness Sanctuary, a permanent conservation trust that Elias and Sarah now helped manage from the city. The gemstones remain buried beneath the silt, not as a source of wealth, but as the secret heart of a forest that would never be hollowed out by greed. To finalize the transition, a representative from the National Conservation Trust arrived at the headwaters. Evelyn Vance was a woman in her late 30s with a presence that commanded respect without raising her voice. She had deep mahogany skin and wore her dark hair in intricate braids adorned with small silver beads that chimed softly when she moved. Her eyes were a warm, intelligent brown, and she possessed a personality that was as resilient as the timber she worked to protect. She wore a practical green utility vest over a white linen shirt, her boots showing the dust of 1,000 trails. Evelyn was the one who had navigated the final legal labyrinths, her sharp intellect and fierce love for the wild, making her a natural ally for Jack. As she handed him the final stamped documents, she looked at the bamboo sanctuary with a look of genuine wonder, recognizing it not as a structure, but as a living bridge between humanity and the wild. The transition of the family was the most profound symphony of all. Elias and Sarah returned to the mountain often, no longer bringing black SUVs and legal threats, but bringing supplies and a newfound desire to contribute. Elias had traded his bespoke charcoal suits for rugged outdoor gear, his flinty gray eyes now spending more time looking at the horizon than at a computer screen. Sarah had replaced her gold jewelry with simple leather bands, her clinical blonde hair often tied back as she learned from Mara how to identify medicinal herbs. They were no longer the invaders. They were the stewards. The bird's nest on the cliff had become their common ground, a place where the shadows of their collective past were finally replaced by the warmth of a shared future. The scars of the family reunion had healed, leaving behind a bond that was as strong as the paracord knots holding the bamboo together. Lila and Gideon were frequent visitors, their presence a reminder that the sanctuary was part of a larger, thriving community of the heart. Jack continued his life in the mountains, his days filled with the rhythmic clack-clack of woodworking and the quiet joy of caring for the creatures that had claimed the sanctuary as their own. He spent his afternoons in the workshop Gideon had helped him build, crafting furniture from fallen cedar and bamboo that carried the spirit of the forest. The Forest King, the massive black bear with the silver chevron, remained a silent guardian of the perimeter. He would often appear at the edge of the clearing in the twilight, his dark, ancient eyes reflecting the hearth's glow. He didn't come for food, but for the mutual respect that had been forged in the moment of mercy beneath the hemlocks. He would stand at a distance, his massive ears occasionally waving in the breeze, a living testament to the soldier's choice to heal rather than destroy. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks on a particularly golden evening, Jack sat on the porch with Cooper curled at his feet. The silence was absolute, a sacred harmony that felt like the final note of a long, arduous symphony. He reached into the inner pocket of his beige jacket and pulled out the tattered leather journal. He flipped through the pages, past the sketches of the bridge that had fallen, past the drawings of the floor that Cooper had tested, and past the names of his siblings carved into the pillars. He reached the very last page, which had remained blank until this moment. With a hand that was steady and sure, Jack took a pen and wrote a final line in his father's looping script. "Mission accomplished, we are home." He closed the book and looked out over the Sapphire River. The silent march was over. The fragments were whole. The sanctuary was complete, and for the first time in his life, the soldier was no longer looking for a battle. He was simply living the dream his father had drawn for them all. The journey of Jack and Cooper is a beautiful testament to the resilience of the human heart. By building a sanctuary from bamboo and memory, Jack transformed a worthless cliff into a fortress of mercy. He proved that the true gems of this world are not found in mines, but in the bonds of family, the loyalty of a dog, and the courage to choose healing over greed. Life often leaves us fractured, yet this story reminds us that our scars are not the end. They are where the light gets in. When we walk our own silent march with faith and persistence, we find that the most rugged trails lead to the most breathtaking peace. Remember, a miracle isn't always a grand spectacle. It is God's hand moving through a child's dream, the intuition of a loyal companion, or the quiet reconciliation of a broken family. In your daily life, look for His grace in the small moments of kindness and the strength to keep a promise. You are never walking alone. If Jack's story touched your soul, please share it with a loved one who needs hope today. Comment below to share your own journey of healing and subscribe to join our community. May God's peace be your sanctuary, and may He bless you and your family always.